So this morning we're going to talk about looking at what you can't see. Now, doesn't that sound like a contradiction in terms? Looking at what you can't see. But if we're going to find the ability in our lives to overcome our troubles, to overcome our afflictions, we have to learn to start looking at what we cannot see. That is the key to overcoming the things that we face in life. And we'll find tremendous help, tremendous power for our lives if we can just learn to do this. Look at what you cannot see. And so what we're going to do this morning, turn over to 2 Corinthians chapter 4 that Dominic read for us. We are going to look at Paul's life because Paul here gives us an insight into his life, into the things that he faced, the struggles and the trials and afflictions that came upon him. And then we're going to ask the question, Paul, how did you get through this? How did you not lose heart? How did you find the strength and the ability to keep going? And the key here, again, we have to look at what we can't see. And so we'll look at Paul's life and see what we can learn from the Lord as we look at Paul and what he went through. So let's start in 2 Corinthians 4 in verse 5 this morning. Paul says, "For we do not preach ourselves, but Christ Jesus as Lord, and ourselves as your bondservants for Jesus' sake. For God, who said, 'Light shall shine out of darkness,' is the one who has shone in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Christ." I mean, Paul knows that in his ministry, in his preaching the Word of God, that the knowledge of the glory of God, that God is shining into the hearts of people. Paul knows that. That's what Paul is about. That's why he preaches and teaches. And so, that's an amazing thing there in verse 6. Light shall shine out of darkness. And the one who has shone in our hearts to give us the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Christ. He's hearkening back to what he said earlier at the end of chapter 5, that we as Christians with unveiled face, we behold the glory of Jesus himself. And as we look at the glory of Jesus, we are being transformed, molded, shaped, as we look at the glory of Christ. And so he goes on in verse 7, "But we have this treasure in earthen vessels, so that the surpassing greatness of the power will be of God and not from ourselves." We have this treasure in earthen vessels, in clay jars, in other words. This treasure, this shining of the light of the glory of God into our hearts, this transformation of seeing the glory that comes from seeing the glory of Christ. This is a great treasure, and Paul says, though, this treasure is in earthen vessels. It's in clay jars. He's likening himself and his body to just a clay pot. Fragile, breakable. This great treasure God has seen fit to put into us as people with our inadequacies and our failures and our shortcomings and our struggles. We have this treasure in earthen vessels. Why is that? Why did God choose to do it that way? In verse 7, he gives us the answer. "So that the surpassing greatness of the power will be of God and not from ourselves." It's so that people can see this surpassing greatness of power is coming from God himself. It's not coming from Paul. It's not coming from the wisdom of man. It's not coming from the power of man. But look at verse 8 with me. We begin to get an insight here into Paul's life and into the troubles and afflictions that he faced. Verse 8 we read, "We are afflicted in every way, but not crushed." Paul was afflicted in every way. This is an interesting word, afflicted. It has the idea of being hard pressed, and some versions put it that way. We are hard pressed. I picture it as, walking into a canyon and the walls are getting narrower and narrower and pressing down upon you. And that's the idea of this word. And we put it this way: I feel like I'm between a rock and a hard place. And I'm pressed down and I'm under this pressure. Paul says we're like that. We're afflicted. We're under this pressure in every way. But we're not crushed. Oh, we feel the pressure, but we're not crushed. He goes on in verse 8 and says, we're perplexed. I think if I were Paul, and if I were in his shoes, this would be the thing I would struggle with the most. Being perplexed, confused, at a loss, because here I am. I'm trying to spread the gospel message of Christ. I'm trying my best to follow the Lord and do what He wants me to do, and yet I face trouble and heartache and sorrow and riots and stonings and beatings. And wouldn't you, if you were in Paul's shoes, wouldn't you think, God, where are you? God, why are you letting this happen to me? God, I'm so confused. And sometimes we get that way in our lives, don't we? God, why haven't you answered my prayer? God, I'm confused. I'm trying my best to follow you, and yet these bad things are happening to me, and we can become perplexed and just at a loss. Paul says, we've felt that, right? We are perplexed, but we're not despairing. See, I feel that pressure. I feel the confusion, but we are not crushed. We are not despairing. Look at verse 9. He says, we're persecuted, but not forsaken. Oh, the persecution that Paul went through was terrible. The things that he had to go through for his faith and because of his preaching was just very heavy for him. And yet he says, we're persecuted, but we're not forsaken. We're struck down, pushed down into the dirt on a daily basis, but we are not destroyed. Verse 10, always carrying about in the body the dying of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may also be manifested in our body. For we who live are constantly being delivered over to death for Jesus' sake, so that the life of Jesus may also be manifested in our mortal flesh. We are constantly delivered over to death for the sake of Jesus. They face death on a daily basis. And so again, we're asking the question, Paul, how could you go through all of this and not lose heart, and not give up, and not throw in the towel? Because he faced so much in his life. Look at verse 12. So death works in us, but life in you. But having the same spirit of faith, according to what is written, I believed, therefore I spoke. We also believe, therefore we also speak. Paul, why do you do it? Why do you keep going? Why do you keep up with this ministry? He says, it's because I believe. I believe in Jesus, and therefore I speak about Jesus. He goes on in verse 14 and says, knowing that he who raised the Lord Jesus will raise us also with Jesus and present us with you. Paul, why do you keep doing this? Why do you keep going? Because I know that we're going to be raised with Jesus. We're going to be presented together with you. And he says in verse 15, for all things are for your sakes, so that the grace which is spreading to more and more people may cause the giving of thanks to abound, to the glory of God. Paul, why do you do it? Why do you keep going? Because I want the grace of God to keep spreading to more and more people. I want more and more people to give up thanks to God and glorify God. That's why I do it. But he says something very interesting in verse 16, very powerful. An amazing statement. Look at verse 16 with me. He says, therefore we do not lose heart. Therefore we do not lose heart. How can he say that? What did Paul know that we don't know? What did Paul understand that we don't understand? How did he view life? How could he say, I don't lose heart. No matter what I go through, I don't give up. I don't lose heart because I want that in my life. I mean, we're talking about a man. He's afflicted, but he doesn't lose heart. He's perplexed, but he doesn't lose heart. He's struck down in constant danger of death, but he doesn't lose heart. In 1 Corinthians chapter 4, Paul says this about himself, that we're viewed as the scum of the world. That's what he actually says. The scum of the world, the dregs of society. He says that we've been imprisoned and beaten and whipped and shipwrecked. He goes through this long list in 2 Corinthians chapter 11 of all the things he's been through, and yet he says, we do not lose heart. What's the secret to this? I want this for my life. Don't you want this for your life? That no matter what I go through, I'm not going to give up. I'm not going to lose heart. I want to know how to do this. And what I want us to see this morning is that the Lord will tell us right here how you and I can victoriously overcome our problems, our struggles, our disappointments, our afflictions. We can victoriously overcome these things. And God is going to show us how to do it as we look at the life of Paul. So we're going to see this morning 4 things, 4 attitudes, 4 mindsets that we must have if we are going to learn to not lose heart, if we're going to learn to victoriously overcome our problems and tribulations in this life. And so let's read on. The first thing we see here in verse 16, we must focus on the inner, not on the outer. Focus on the inner person, not on the outer. And so he says in 16, therefore we do not lose heart, but though our outer man is decaying, yet our inner man is being renewed day by day. We do not lose heart. Why, Paul? Because I focus on the inner man, not on the outer. Most people go through their lives focusing on the outer man, the outer person. We focus on our health. We focus on exercise. We focus on being young and maintaining our youth and being wrinkle-free. And you look at the commercials on television, what's it all about? Being young and maintaining your youth and looking good and looking healthy. And it's not that the body is without importance. It's not that we should just not think about our health. But where is our focus in life? Sometimes we go about as if like this is the only thing that we have, is what's outer, what we can see, our body. But Paul gives us a great truth here in 16. Our outer person is decaying. I want you to feel your hand and your arm. What is your body made of? Our body is made from the dust of the earth. And it's decaying. And it's going to go back to the dust of the earth. We need to get that into our minds and face that reality. It is inevitable. Our bodies are decaying. We grow older, we face illness, we face disease. That's just the way that it is. Now let me ask you a question. If all of your hope and all of your focus is on your outer person, on your body, where is that going to leave you when you face sickness? When you face cancer, when you face heart disease, when you face COVID, when you face the ravages of old age, where is that going to leave you if all of your focus and all of your hope is placed in the outer person? The outer man is decaying. We need to realize that. If the outer is all that we have, we don't have anything. The outer man was made of the dust of the earth, and to the dust of the earth it will return. But there is an inner person. We all have an inner being. That's the part of you that is important. That's the part of you that's important because that's the part of you that's eternal. We're talking about your heart and your soul and your spirit. These are the parts of you that are eternal, that will never fade away. That's the part of us that we need to focus on. And so if we have that point of view, focused on the inner man, the inner person. Yes, my body may fail because of sickness and disease, but in the inner man, there is power. My body may deal with the ravages of old age, if the Lord allows us to live that long. But the inner man, there is radiant, glowing, and light coming from God Himself as God shines into our hearts and we see Jesus Christ and we behold His glory. The soul, the inner man, the heart is glowing. And though my outer person may be ravaged by time, in the inner person there is transformation, there is renewal. And if we can focus on that, won't it help us to overcome our trials? Won't it help us to overcome our sicknesses? Won't it help us to have hope when we face things in life? Because this is just a container for who I really am. I'm going to focus on the inner man. I remember not too long ago, my grandmother, who was a faithful Christian all her life, she was dying. And I got to go home and I got to be with her as she lie there on her deathbed. And what do you see if all you're focused on is the outer person? You see a frail body, ravaged by time and age and disease. But that's not all there is there. If that's all we're seeing, we're missing it. Because there is an inner person. And the inner person of this faithful Christian, the soul is glowing. The soul is growing nearer to God. The soul is empowered, even though the body may be weak. And so you may see elderly Christians who are faithful and they can't get around like they used to get around and they want to, but if they could focus on the inner, that I'm becoming stronger, I'm becoming radiant, the soul is glowing because of what God is doing and transforming in me. You see, if we can see that and stop looking only at what we can see and look at what we can't see, it would make all the difference for us. So focus on the inner being, not the outer. Again, the outer man is decaying, but the inner man is being renewed day by day. There's a constant renewal that God is working in us. Every single day, we're becoming stronger and better and brighter in the inner man. And so that's the first step. Let's read on to verse 17. Paul says next, "For momentary light affliction is producing for us an eternal weight of glory, far beyond all comparison." Secondly, we see we need to focus on having an eternal perspective. Isn't it amazing that Paul says here, momentary light affliction is producing for us an eternal weight of glory? When you look at the sufferings of Paul, do you think of them as momentary and light? Do we think being stoned and stoned so badly that people thought you were dead and they drug you out of the city, does that seem light to you? Does floating around in the ocean because you've been in a shipwreck, because you were arrested and were going to be taken to see Caesar, Does that sound momentary and light to you? Does it sound like going through years and years of preaching and being chased by violent mobs and being thrown into prison and beaten? Does that sound momentary and light? How can he say that? Well, I submit to you he can say that because Paul had an eternal perspective. And when you and I, think about this, when you and I are on the other side of this life, when we step into eternity, and we look back and we look at our lives, won't all of the troubles, as bad as they are, won't all of the heartaches, as bad as they are, won't they seem momentary and light, viewed from the perspective of eternity? When we've been there 10,000 years, bright shining as the sun, and we look back on our troubles and our trials, won't it be worth it? Won't they seem momentary and light to us? And so we have to have an eternal perspective. If all we think about is this life, we're missing it. And we're going to become discouraged and we're going to lose heart. But we need to think from an eternal focus, an eternal perspective. There's another thing that we see here in verse 17. Notice that he says that momentary light afflictions are producing for us an eternal weight of glory far beyond all comparison. Did you catch that? The trials and the tribulations, the afflictions, they are producing something in us. And we often don't see that or think about that. And it's not that the trials and tribulations that we're going to have great things produced in us in spite of the tribulations, but it's because of the trials. They're producing, they're working, they're achieving something in us. How is that? Well, you look at passages like Romans chapter 5, where Paul says we rejoice in our tribulations. How can you do that? How can you rejoice when things go wrong? How can you rejoice when things are so bad for you at times, Paul? We rejoice because we know that the sufferings are producing something in us. And he says there in Romans chapter 5 that our tribulations produce for us perseverance. See, something good is produced from the suffering. Perseverance produces proven character, and proven character, hope. And so wonderful things are happening if we will see it that way, if we will follow the Lord and realize these afflictions are producing something for us. James chapter 1 says it too. Count it all joy, my brethren, when you fall into various trials. Why? Why should I count it all joy? Knowing that the trying of your faith produces patience. Let patience have its perfect result, that you may be perfect and entire, lacking in nothing. God is working on us through the trials. It's producing something wonderful in us. It's hard to see that when you're going through it, isn't it? It's hard to understand that, but we have to shift the way that we think. We have to shift our focus and our perspective and understand that God is producing something. And he says here in verse 17, what is it producing for us? He says it's producing an eternal weight of glory far beyond all comparison. So I picture it like this weight of glory in heaven, and every trial that I go through, if I hold on to the Lord, if I go through it with Him, with the right attitude and the right heart, every trial I'm adding to this eternal weight of glory up in heaven. So instead of every trial and every affliction pounding me down a little bit more and hammering me down, instead, if I see things in the proper way, I'm adding to this eternal weight of glory. The trials are producing something in us, something wonderful in us. Paul understood that, and that's how he can say we don't lose heart, because he had this perspective. And finally, and this is really a summary of everything we've seen, we need to focus on what is unseen. Focus on what you can't see. Look at verse 17 again. For momentary light affliction is producing for us an eternal weight of glory far beyond all comparison, while we look not at the things which are seen, but the things which are not seen. While we look, I'm submitting to you that this means because we look not at the things which are seen, but the things which are unseen. Provided that we stop looking at what is seen and start looking at what we can't see. You see, that's the key. That's the secret. That's how Paul could have this attitude of never giving up, of never losing heart, because he chose to look at what he can't see. We need to stop looking at what's right in front of us. The trials, the sickness, death, financial problems, these temporary things that capture our attention, these outer things. We need to stop looking at the outer, but look at the things that you can't see in the inner person. Start looking at what you can't see. Look at the inner. Look at Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, who we can't see with our eyes, but we can see through the eyes of faith. Look at this eternal weight of glory that we're adding to, that's being produced for us and worked for us as we go through these trials. Focus your eyes on your heavenly home, which you can't see with your eyes, but that's what you need to be looking at. Focus on the promises of God. Walk by faith and not by sight. And we too can learn to overcome. We too can learn to not lose heart no matter what we face, if we'll learn to look at what we can't see. The unseen things are the important things in life. The unseen things are the eternal things in life. Everything else is temporary. So let's shift our focus, let's shift our mindset, and look at what we can't see. If you're here this morning and you need the prayers of the church, we would love to pray for you. If you want to learn more about becoming a Christian, if you want to put Christ on in baptism, we invite you to do so. It's the Lord's invitation. So please come while we stand and while we sing.